All right. So I am with Jim from Combating the Narrative, and I appreciate his content. He's gotten to this relatively recently, I guess the last 9 months, a year or so. And first of all, I guess I just like to ask, like, how did you get into this? What was the primary inspiration? Were there other content creators that you were inspired by, or, how were
Ye-
you inspired to get into this?
Really, how I got to be a part of the dissident right was, well, I was always more of a conservative, more right-leaning, but really Ryan Falk alt-hype is what sort of pushed me over the edge into what would now be called the alt-right or the dissident right, and that was probably circa 2015. So, obviously he's been an influence. Guys like Devin Stack with Black Pilled, if you're unfamiliar, have been an influence, but really what got me into making content was just watching all the things happening in the world around us, the rapid decline of the West and the United States in particular, and everything that went on with COVID. I really just couldn't sit idly by and do absolutely nothing. But, well, what is a guy to do? And so I started creating content just in the hopes that I could get my voice out there. And even if I convince one or two people who otherwise would not have been on our side or seen things our way, even if I could have that little effect, it would be something. I'm out here trying to make the world a better place.
Sure. Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. And it's kind of the intuitive response to the insanity that you see from mainstream media and just like absurd, obvious contradictions in woke narratives. And anyone who's paying attention, who's rational, will notice these things. And, the obvious response is to try to get the word out. But, in my worldview, the way I see things, getting the word out doesn't amount to much. The way I see it, like in the Middle Ages, the average peasant was extremely anti-Semitic, but that didn't really help them displace Jewish power in banking or things like that. So I don't think that, red pilling the masses is a viable way forward. So I'm just curious, if this is what you're inspired to do, what do you see happening from waking people up to issues like this?
Well, first and foremost, I just want to recognize too that um, we're engaged. There's a reason I'm combating the narrative, right? Instead of addressing or revising the narrative or something to that effect. We have to realize that, to quote the old adage of Karl von Clausewitz, war is merely the continuation of political policy by other means. And we're here met on a great battlefield of that conflict. And we're seeing something novel in terms of how conflict is taking place, particularly in the West, where we've got these governments and institutions that are not representing the will of the people they govern. And so people are shifting their primary allegiance away from those governments to something else, usually race, but sometimes religion, that sort of thing. So um, I understand that, especially due to the demographic shift here in the United States, some sort of ideological reconquista of the United States is out of the question. However, at one point, people like you, people like me, people like the people listening were probably not ideological adherents of whatever you want to dub our particular worldview. Dissident right usually does me just fine, but I know some people take issue with that. So it's primarily a numbers game in that regard, right? If people are never exposed to the truth, they're never going to join our side, so to speak, and we're going to be fighting an even greater uphill battle. Um, in particular, what I take issue with is these deliberate misinterpretations of history aimed at driving a modern day political narrative. In order to do something truly awful to somebody, in order to justify heinous acts like we're seeing today, you have to drum up a narrative that that particular group of targeted people, in this instance, white people, or Western society more broadly, Um, they've created this narrative that we are responsible for genocides and other great atrocities, and if left unchecked, we will continue to perpetuate a sort of injustice. So that sort of blood libel is something we can't let stand. Now, that's only one prong of, really a three-part offensive that I see the right as the right course of action for us here on the Dissident Right. The other piece of it is we have to get offline and into the real world in terms of not committing acts of terror, God forbid, if you haven't seen my video, but engaging in protests, engaging in participation in local government. All these things are the way forward, because if we sit here and we know that violence isn't going to work, we know that the odds are stacked against us. If we sit here and we do nothing, if we allow ourselves to be cowed into, inaction by the mere specter of infiltration from the federal government, I mean, then it's already lost. Why even bother talking about this sort of thing? We have to take some action. It's just a matter of what that is.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I can sympathize with that for sure. Now, as far as entering local government, as far as that's possible, that's all well and good, but I don't see how you coordinate that. This is something I've had a criticism about with regard to Nick Fuentes's strategy, the America First movement, and what they're doing. Like, in principle, it's a great idea. Red pill all of these politically active young people, get them on a track to become politically influential. But the problem is, like, obviously we live under a surveillance state. And if you're interfacing with content from Nick Fuentes, very likely you will be completely discredited at some point in your political career because those connections will come to light. So how do you, on the one hand, protect against that eventuality? On the other hand, the other criticism I have of Nick and his kind of strategy is, how do you expedite training people to become engaged in political activism? To my mind, unless you have physical institutions where young people can go and be trained in these techniques, then you're just sort of engaged in wishful thinking. So what do you think about those two criticisms?
I'd like to dial in on a particular phrase you said, physical institutions. So let's take a step back and let me give you my desired end state. I know that most people listening haven't heard of me. I'm sure that you haven't watched every single minute of my content, just like I haven't watched all of yours. But my desired end state is a sort of national divorce. I think that the rot has spread to such a degree that the dissolution of the United States, or balkanization, is almost an inevitability at this point. And in order to really shift the course of our people, of our nation, not the United States, but our, whatever you want to call us, there's not a great term for it, but we need to have those heritage Americans. I like that. Or heritage Americans. Founding stock is another one. But in order to shift the trajectory we're on, which is not leading us to a very good place, I don't think that's in dispute. We do have to wrest control of some of these physical institutions. And so with that end state in mind, we have to walk back how we get to that, because that's a tremendous undertaking, right? The system is stacked against us. But you have to understand that things have shifted. Change comes quick, right? Since the turn of the century is really when things started to get bad, the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, to be clear. And from that point, this nation has dramatically changed. So within a few generations, we're capable of altering the course of the United States. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility to do this sort of thing. But with that end state in mind, what are concrete actions that people like you and I can take today? Well, yes, we have to start founding parallel institutions. Now, what do I mean by parallel institutions? I mean, we probably need to get behind one singular alternate social media platform to have a viewer base or a user base large enough to actually compete with Twitter. And I understand that there are issues with hosting such a site, and you'll get payment processors that'll give you a hard time. But again, we can't allow ourselves to be cowed into an action by seemingly insurmountable odds.
Okay.
Now, on top of that, we need to really get involved in your local community, because the type of government that has the greatest impact on your day-to-day life, right, is not actually the federal government, not insofar as things you're interfacing with on a daily basis are concerned. Yeah, I mean, you can talk about immigration. That's a unique issue in that respect. So, yeah, you can say that your political career is dead, but if you associate with people like Nick Fuentes, but not everybody has to know that you associate with Nick Fuentes or you're an adherent to that. And in terms of,
it's just easier and easier to find out
right,
the more involved you become.
Well, and in terms of coordinating such a thing too, that's where one of my projects that I'd like to work on is sort of banding together a network of smaller content creators to start driving a narrative in our own small way, because that's how it starts. A very small subset of the population has completely subverted what the United States was, what the West was. And we need to start acting like what we are, dissidents. We are the subversive element now, because the rot has spread so far. So, yeah, there always is risk associated with doing anything. That's where I've talked about too. Is a group like Patriot Front a Fed honeypot? I don't know. Maybe. I'm not a member, right? But the easy answer to something like that is, okay, so what if it's a Fed honeypot? Don't do anything illegal. Don't conspire to kidnap Governor Whitmer. Don't conspire to attack critical infrastructure here in the United States. And then it makes their job more and more difficult to be able to really get something to stick. So, and you have to remember too that the left has not been afraid of social consequences, and that's part of the reason that they're coming out on top. They don't care if they get arrested for rioting during, not just the BLM riots, but the Rodney King riots and a lot of the civil rights actions going on. Like they don't care. That's part and parcel of agitating for radical political change.
Right. But I think they understand that they have overwhelming institutional support from the get-go, whereas actual dissidents, right-wing dissidents, don't have that advantage. Okay, so one other point is, it would be nice to have a social media alternative somewhere that was genuinely free speech, where the best ideas could win out. I do believe that conservative right-wing ideas tend to win out in an open forum of debate, and internet censorship has in large part been about combating those narratives from the far right, which were, surprisingly successful, I think, in the eyes of the establishment. But I don't think that amounts to the kind of training that would-be political activists and, professional politicians get from Ivy League universities, which is kind of the actual power center at the heart of the establishment. It's these schools where people go for years on end and become inculcated into a way of life, a way of thinking that is systematic. And that gives this power center a huge amount of integration. So that aligns their values, and it allows them then to function as a kind of unified front. And on the right, we don't have that advantage because we don't have similar institutions. Even if we had like a fully uh, free speech Twitter, we would still have the problem of factionalism in the far right. To some extent, this is sort of a tangent from the points we're talking about here, but I think like far right, in a certain sense, is a proxy for like Neanderthal admixture. And there are these two ways of being, like the Neolithic civilizational model that people like Bronze Age pervert has characterized as like the way of the longhouse, right? There is this way of life, and then there's the more ancient Mesolithic European way of life that manifests itself in historical time as like the Germanic way. Okay, so in a large part, like the far right manifests as like the Germanic type in history today. And an issue with the Germanic type is that they are inherently fractious. They don't align well because they aren't motivated by abstract ideology to the extent that people in that Neolithic sphere are. That's the people on the left who buy these oppression narratives, this set of narratives, this worldview that works very well on paper, seemingly, but doesn't accord with intuition. People on the far right, the more kind of Neanderthal side of things, Germanic side of things, believe in these deep intuitions. And so it's very hard to persuade people on that side through rational discourse into some like uniform ideological front. They're just not adapted to ideological thinking. They're inherently suspicious of ideology. That makes it difficult to align their thinking. Universities have the advantage of bringing people together at a kind of super ideological level, where people in Ivy League universities don't necessarily all subscribe to exactly the same ideology, strictly speaking, but they are aligned in terms of value and framing and a bunch of other factors just by virtue of that shared experience. So that's something that I think is indispensable for a right wing victory going forwards. So I don't disagree with the points that you're making. You know, we do have to act in some sense if we want to preserve, you know, heritage, American identity, and the goods that come with that, what we have inherited from our ancestors. But it seems like without this factor, like what the Ivy League universities provide for the left, if we don't have something comparable on the right, then I don't see how we can possibly compete.
Right. And I think you've identified truly what has hamstrung the dissident right to this point. I mean, I know there was much ado about Nick Fuentes a couple of weeks back talking about how the ethno state is going to be Catholic, and that really stirred up a hornet's nest. And that's where really what the right needs to do, the primary narrative we need to start pushing is, again, thou shalt not bash to the right. That needs to become our 11th commandment. And we need to start driving that from what institutional power, you know, what limited institutional power we have. Voices like you and I to a degree, but much larger voices, you know, people much bigger than us would be a key place to start. And that's where, you know, the problem with the right too is they fail to understand the nature of the conflict that they're engaged in. So the people on the left. Off the
bat, though, before we go on to other points, this issue of don't punch right, this is something that I've pushed back on. I've been at this for about 10 years. And originally, I didn't have like political intentions. I'm kind of a philosophy YouTuber. And as I put out my own philosophy 10 years ago, I got comments from people who had far right political leanings, and they were effective in making me aware of certain issues that I cannot deny at this point. But in any case, and in fact, I lost my train of thought, so I apologize for that.
No, it's fine.
I might edit this out.
My train of thought is very easily derailed as well, so we're on the same page. But And I'm not meaning to deflect from that point, but the point I was trying to make is that the left is inherently just as, if not more, disunited on the whole than the right
Right.
is, because
Right.
what is the left, right? What's the overarching thing that unites the left? The Democratic Party is somehow both the party of, you know, Catholics from South America, radical Islamic extremists, and transvestites. How
Right.
does that meld
Okay.
together? Because in any
So,
other circumstance,
mhm.
these people would be diametrically opposed to one another, and it's because they've all got it in their head that they on an intuitive level seem to understand that the conflict here is between the native population, traditional heritage Americans, and themselves. And so they're willing to put aside these, and I hesitate to even call them petty, because they're not petty. They're really important
Mhm.
questions. But they're willing to put that stuff aside for the time being to attack the much greater threat of white people existing in the West. And so that's
Okay. Right. So the thing that the left has done then is they have a center of their ideology in the form of these Ivy League institutions where certain norms are defined tightly. And then they have a kind of hierarchy of dependent classes that all benefit from this central narrative. That doesn't exist on the right. And I think that's kind of the critical weakness of the right. Because the left controls like the institutions that confer economic advantage when you attend them, uh, they don't really need like the one true ideology and then kind of the uh, set of dependent, vassal groups that are all kind of rallied around that. They don't need one true ideology. They can have like the one elite consensus ideology. And that's like the cutting edge of that is the transhumanism, trans ideology, all of the stuff with LGBTQ, the whole set like feminism, all of that has its kind of cutting edge, which is defined in elite universities. And then uh, groups find themselves aligned with that agenda kind of for incidental factors, a constellation of material interests or whatever political interests they may temporarily have in common. And they're very pragmatic. Like the people who are promulgating this stuff on the left, I don't think are true believers in trans ideology, and yet they recognize its utility in the service basically of this kind of ultimate agenda of total top down social control. On the right, we don't have that kind of cutting edge. This is the kind of core of the ideology because we're too factionalized. We have too many different competing worldviews on the right. So this is why I've pushed back against don't punch right narratives. I understand the kind of basic logic that we have more in common than we have not in common, and it's better for us to act against the people who are actually our enemies on the left, and so you want to form this unified front on the right. But the problem is that cutting edge, that like core, really well defined ideology gives you leverage and it gives the whole movement a center of gravity that gives it like intelligibility. The left coalition wouldn't be intelligible unless there was a well defined center that had like a bunch of highly paid professional sophists working full time, giving justifications for intersectionality, etc. Right? It's because they have that ideological core, and because they will purity spiral in order to defend that ideological territory, and like have that as something that's very explicit and well documented and institutionally embedded. That's what allows their coalition to function. On the right, if we embrace don't punch right, my fear is we don't come to this really well defined ideological cutting edge on the right. And instead, it's always going to be this kind of illusion of the Big Tent. Like that's the idea of the Republican Party since Goldwater. And I don't think it's really worked ever. All you get is like people who purport to be on the side of conservatives, but conservatism is so ill-defined that today we have conservatives who advocate trans rights. It's like
Right.
it's right.
Right. They've completely failed to conserve anything of value. And I understand what you're getting at, right? We don't have these well-defined institute. We don't have the cathedral backing us. We don't have that same institutional power anymore. But to a degree, like our ideological narrative came from somewhere. What we believe came from somewhere. And true, it is a little more decentralized, but it came from, voices on the right. It came from places like, as silly as it sounds, free speech platforms or free speech, not really a full platform, drawing a blank on the term, but places like 4chan and 8chan, and where there was little to no curation of the content. And so I understand what you're saying. I'm not saying don't ever criticize somebody who, slaps an R in front of their name. That's how we got to this point. I would agree. There should be a set of core tenets that you have to, a sort of neo-Nicene creed for people on the right that you have to adhere to be able to call yourself a member of our institution. But that threshold needs to be set pretty low. And the people speaking on the right, the people with sway and influence, need to be hammering home on, okay, the barrier for entry, it's be pro-white and anti 2% club. So I don't think it's completely impossible, especially if but I understand what you're driving at, and that's where there needs to be a push from us on the right to not only get our narrative out there on these mainstream platforms, and that would be difficult in and of itself, but sort of within our own movements, band together and amplify each other's voices, create some sort of new cathedral for our side of the aisle, even if it's something as simple as, a few of the key players getting together in a Discord to hash it out. So, and because that barrier for entry is so low, because we're facing a literal existential threat, I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility to get people who, and we'll always have purity spiraling, right? People are always, as we're discussing these other topics, people will always disagree on one tenet or another. But as long as publicly we're still focusing primarily on, launching an offensive against these hateful narratives pushed by the left, a degree of that is okay. So that's primarily what I'm driving at with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, two things. The second, what you said last, I do agree that there has to be pushback. That's why I want to talk to you. Like, combating the narrative is a good idea. There are aggressive narratives against our interests being pushed all the time with funding. And if people just get complacent about pushing back, then obviously, you're just kind of opening the way for the enemy to make any inroads they want in the minds of young men and young women, and that's a horrible thing.
And that's where we've seen the Overton window shift to where it is right now.
Right. I mean, there has been pushback online over the last 10 years, and often, like, in terms of like the populist involvement, that right-wing pushback has overwhelmed left-wing institutional consensus. The whole reason I was saying that I've been at this for 10 years, originally I was a philosophy YouTuber, is like, it's surprising how persistent this decentralized right-wing force is. And I think ultimately that is because there is a kind of deeper ideological consensus in the background represented by, the kind of old right Carlyle traditionalism, this anti-liberal or illiberal way of thinking that represented like a bedrock of Western civilizational thought for many centuries, for millennia, going back to Plato and Aristotle, these ideas. And because the liberal intellectual superstructure is so shallow, like given free reign of ideas, it's natural that this like massive classical, medieval, early modern way of thought would come to the surface and would represent like a coherent alternative in some degree. Still, though, I think the further we move in time away from those sources, the more disintegrated our thought becomes and the less like coherently defined in terms of that core ideology. And that's what I'm mostly concerned about, is defining that core ideology. But I don't think purely ideological thinking about these matters is sufficient. I first and foremost kind of consider myself a philosopher, and philosophy originally was not meant to be like sussing out a comprehensive ideology of things. It was meant to be a way of life, and that involved practices like on a day-to-day basis. There are different accounts of the origin of the term philosophy, but I favor the account that has Pythagoras coming up with this label, philosophy. And Pythagoras started physical institutions where people would go and engage in like deep asceticism and fundamental transformative exercises. And I think that is the way that actual radical historical change is really made. Christianity had this radical impact on society, I think partly because the original Christian communities operated according to a completely different logic to what the rest of Roman civilization abided by. You have to depart from like the day to day and shift that way of life in order to open up the field of possibility and let like revolutionary change happen. So, I understand that you need to push back on the narrative now. And right now we have like Discord and these other tools at our fingertips. But looking forward, I don't see a path to victory. I don't see a way of combating this kind of institutional consensus, the left-wing consensus that like most of the billionaires on the planet abide by, most of the governments around the world abide by. I don't see any meaningful pushback on that happening just by like free speech and decentralized internet commentators, unless somehow we can capture the same sort of technology that is used by the Ivy Leagues, that was used in Plato's Academy, that was used in the Pythagorean communities or the Christian communities. Unless we can like tap into that, I don't think we'll have that centralizing force to really make the difference. And so that's because I see like a kind of hopelessness in the populism. I have not gotten very involved myself in like pushing back against anti-white narratives. Even though I see them, I recognize they're a salient factor of things, and like, they're real. We have to do something about them. But as it stands, if you engage in that in an explicit way, you'll just be censored, your opportunities will be taken away from you. And on the other hand, I see like in order for that strategy to move forward and actually work, there has to be this deeper integrating factor, which I think can only be like a physical institution that trains people, that changes their way of thinking, that aligns them in a deeper sense than ideology, but also involves ideological consensus building. So
Right.
that's, yeah.
And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. In talking about establishing parallel structures, right? My concern is, I'm kind of a critic of something like the Butler Plan, which, if you're not familiar, is the Northwestern Front's idea of everybody moves to like Oregon, Idaho, and I think part of Montana. I'm not entirely clear on that part. And, from there, we agitate for institutional power and separation and change. But my concern is that if it's not, that's kind of a reactive strategy. My concern is if you centralize like that, or even if you found these, individual communities, like I've heard of particular churches trying to turn a whole city Christian, or there was some push to turn all of Peoria Dissident Right in Illinois. You've now centralized yourself in a place and made yourself so public that it becomes very, very easy for the powers that be to paint you as double plus bad, and for you to get Waco'd. So there has to be, if we were to go and we were to set up, right, Eric and Jim's, Neoplatonist society, or whatever you want to call it. You want to set up the new cathedral of people like you and I think very, very quickly that gets shut down. We have to understand that we are the subversives, and we have to act like the subversives, and we have to think like a gorilla, not the animal, obviously, but and not in the sense that, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to destroy critical rail infrastructure or something like that. But you have to understand that now you're the subversive element. And yes, I agree that you should get away as much as possible to like-minded communities. You should get out of the city if you're not there already. You should start taking concrete actions to get your personal house in order, to put a degree of separation between yourself and starvation, and the power grid, or at least have an alternative source, because if and when things go kinetic, I mean, you want to be able to decouple yourself from the system. You want to be as unreliant on the system as possible. So I agree with that sort of line of thinking. But if we continue to retreat, if we continue to back, if we continue to isolate ourselves in our own communities, you're never going to achieve meaningful political change. You'll just be put on your own little reservation, and you'll quietly die out. And that's where
that point I've heard very often, that like creating independent communities, new social institutions is a retreat. I don't think that really makes sense, because I mean, imagine if instead of you by yourself producing your YouTube videos, you had a team of like 10 guys working with you, doing research, producing graphics. Like, you can't compete in producing media as an individual against teams. Like, the left wing, the establishment has teams producing their content. That's why millions of people pay to subscribe to Netflix, etc. Like, people want that high production value. High level art requires like collaborative endeavors. So you don't get that in independent far right content creators.
Well, and perhaps
more often than not, they end up just kind of being like, they tailor their content to whatever allows them to continue their revenue streams. Right, like that's a very real problem, grifting on the far right. Like, people can purport to be pro-white or pro-whatever, but ultimately, I think like what allows them to maintain their lifestyle takes precedence. Which, to my mind, unless you tie your lifestyle to accountability in the form of other people like interacting with you on a day-to-day basis, I just don't see how you're gonna like maintain this pure ideological core that I think we both agree is necessary. I don't trust a decentralized process to do it, because what comes out of that is like the top rhetoricians, sophists, and grifters absorb everything and monopolize all the opportunities, and then the people who actually care about ideas end up getting burnt out because it's unrewarding.
Right. And perhaps I should clarify too, I'm not anti going and establishing your own community in and of itself, right? Like I said and I want to make clear again, I think if you're still in the city and you're not in some sort of at least partially like-minded community away from population centers that are hostile to you, you're kind of a fool at this point. But it's sort of akin in my mind to a bunker on a battlefield, right? A bunker has a place. It's a place for you to hunker down and, shelter yourself and separate yourself from the certain death that comes from things like artillery fire, right? But unless you take some concrete action to venture forth from your little base of power there, you're merely delaying the inevitable. So I just don't want people to think that I don't want to just put another separate, degree of separation between ourselves and extinction because we've, moved a few counties over. But I'm not against that sort. And I think in a sense, we're talking about the same thing in establishing parallel communities, just a little different way of going about it, right? So if we put ourselves, and it takes a very small subset of the population to affect meaningful political change and sort of drive a narrative if they're motivated enough. I don't think anybody would contest that. And on a certain level at this point in time, you might have to hide your power level, right? You can't go out there and say, you know what, let me tell you about the 6 million and how I'm a Nick Fuentes fan. That'll be certain political death. But if you slowly start to chip away at the vestiges of power that are closest to you, if you get out there and you say, you know what, instead of sitting here and continuing to eat my goy slop and, subscribe to Netflix and just continue to go about my day, doing my 9 to 5, watching, Rome burn around me, just because the calories keep flowing and, you're not in any true existential danger. You go out there and you run for school board. School boards have a lot of local control. You go out there and you run for sheriff, you run for mayor, you can start to affect small, meaningful, compounding political changes, right? You have to start somewhere. It's just like any investment. The initial investment and initial return on that investment is going to be small. However, if you continue to dump resources into that investment and you stay the course, your returns are going to grow over time. So eventually, my ideal situation is just like the left has done, where they've got, for instance, sanctuary cities are a good example where, hey, we're just not going to enforce federal law with respect to immigration. We're just going to allow a bunch of illegal immigrants to live here. Okay, well, why can't we eventually aim to do the same thing? You know what? We here in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Indiana, we're going to enforce our borders. We're going to summarily deport you with no court date. That's not something that is outside the realm of possibility. It's happened within American history where, the courts have made their decision and they were told that, just continue to make noise. We're not going to listen. Or same thing with things like marijuana usage. I know that's sort of a small potatoes issue, but you have whole states now in direct violation of federal law and nothing is being done about it. And if we can, and it started with municipalities, it started with counties, it started with states. And again, I would agree that without some sort of institutional control, we're dead. We need to wrest institutional control. We need to take back the cathedrals. We need to, just like the universities are doing today, set the upper and lower bounds for what's acceptable discourse. And what's sort of making me a little more optimistic about, our prospects going forward is that for all of human history, standing where we are today with what's acceptable discourse coming out of, neo-Frankfurt schools, all of human history, they're right-wing radical extremists. That seems to be the human default. They seem to be fighting against something that's natural to man, some sort of natural order. And that's where I think we would see a cascading effect if we can start to wrest control of some of these smaller institutions and work our way to larger ones. Because ultimately, right, even if we form our parallel communities, maybe we've kicked the can down the road 100 years if we're not actively agitating to launch an offensive. And why I care so much, and I don't mean to assign equal weight of the things I'm talking about either. I don't want to say that going and shit posting on TikTok is just as important as, seizing local offices. It's not. Right, you can affect more meaningful change by seizing some sort of local office than you can by a couple of TikTok comments. But if we completely cede that battle space, I mean, it infuriates me when I hear people say that, it's just TikTok, it's just Reddit, who cares? Because these people are having their minds melted by these anti-white narratives, anti-Western narratives, and it has very real effects. So unless we're providing some sort of counter to that, and I'm not even saying we're going to come out on top, right? You're going to get brigaded into oblivion, you're going to get ratioed, as the kids say, but maybe, just maybe, there's 10% of the people who are seeing your comment that agree with you and start to look deeper into it, and you've now formed a sort of, admittedly less effective, admittedly way more decentralized, which is both a blessing and a curse, sort of cathedral like you're talking about before. And I don't mean cathedral as some sort of derogatory term towards the Catholic Church. Just the cathedrals were the old universities in the Middle Ages. In that sense, they were the ones who were the drivers of what was acceptable thought in Europe.
Right. Yeah. You, I think, need those institutions, as you're saying, but I think we shouldn't overestimate the amount of ideological consensus that we presume already exists on the right. I think this illusion of the big tent has been very corrosive because, like I said, I think the reason that in a free speech discourse, right-wing ideas come to the surface is because that is the ideological substrate at a deep level underpinning the way that we think about the world from classical antiquity all the way up to John Locke, right? It's so deeply embedded that it's implicit. These ideas naturally come to the surface. People naturally rediscover them. But the thing is, those right-wing ideas haven't had as cogent articulators as the left wing has had with the likes of John Locke and his successors, Rawls, etc. Liberalism is a coherent ideology that actually works. In terms of John Locke, his opponent was Roger Filmer, and Filmer's idea is patriarcha is based on the succession of first sons from Adam. Okay, so if you're a biblical worldview believer, that can sort of work. But if you think that the story of Adam and Eve was allegorical, which even Catholics often today believe, that it doesn't exactly hold water in terms of justifying divine right monarchies, and we've kind of moved past that. The liberals have won in terms of their integrated worldview. On the right, we still have a very loosely affiliated set of ethical norms that we kind of agree on, and mainly the agreement is verbal. You and I can both agree that we want what is best for heritage Americans. But even then, that remains kind of a euphemism. Are we talking about white people generally? And if we are, what are the actual limits of that? What is the white race? That's a left talking point, deconstructing the limits around racial categories for various reasons. But it's a legitimate thing. If you don't have a well-defined concept of the group you're talking about, then those edge cases can kind of detract from the meaningfulness of that identity in an identitarian politics. And that will be used as a vector of attack. So you need to have a well-defined something underlying your ethics, a well-defined ontology, a well-defined metaphysics, a well-defined theology, in order to ground the ethics that your group is kind of confederating around. People on the right, especially in dissident right circles, are content to rally around terms like nationalism, even when basic ideological issues regarding the concept of nationalism have not been addressed. Like I've asked similar questions to many people on the nationalist side of things. Like, okay, if you're a nationalist, do you support the right of every separatist group to have their own territory across the board in every case? On the other hand, what do you do if a separatist group or a rogue nation state is developing weapons of mass destruction and we don't have confidence that their leadership will not actually employ these weapons? That's why we got involved ostensibly, purportedly in Iraq, in these various countries.
Right.
Right. So, those sorts of issues are so ill-defined on the dissident right, broadly speaking, that to me, it's like moving forward, pushing some right-wing agenda is kind of inherently premature because we haven't actually worked out those deeper ideological issues. If you care about, let's just take it to like a pro-white stance. If you're pro-white, that to me is value neutral unless you have a reason for being pro-white. Like if I'm Aboriginal Australian and I'm Aboriginal Australian, I don't see that as a good thing. Like maybe the group that you are is not actually a good thing and is not good for the world. And many white people buy that their group is not a good thing for the world, that we're actually on net a negative thing for the world. So like the bare assertion of like, this is my identity group, I should promulgate it, like that has yet to be justified at a fundamental level in right-wing worldviews, which is why, again, unless you have this like dedicated research institution type environment where people can dig all the way down beneath the level of common sense narratives, beneath the level of rhetoric and propaganda, to actually bring about this like cutting edge, coherent worldview that acts as that centralizing principle, then everything else, like I said before, is just kind of premature. You're advocating for what and why. It's those questions that I feel like have never, just don't end up being fundamentally addressed, and people are generally content with that. And, it makes sense because in building rhetorical arguments, in engaging in sophistry, it helps to appeal to sentiments that are popular, ideas that are popular, and many right-wing ideas are popular. That doesn't mean, though, that it's actually true. So I feel like there is this kind of like emphasis on narratives on the right that ends up being counterproductive in the sense that it detracts from actually discovering the truth of these values. Why is it right to be pro-heritage American? Like at a fundamental level, what is good about us that merits our defending ourselves? Like at that level. And the only way I can see of fixing that is like having a real physical institution where people are like dedicated full time to exploring those things.
Well, and as an aside, that's why I do think some really important work is countering these narratives of, the supposed evils of the British Empire, the supposed evils of colonialism, or the supposed evils of, white expansion into the New World, and bringing both not only qualitative but quantitative measures of the exact improvements and net positives for the world that these entities brought. But I guess we've spent a lot of time talking about what my vision is, and you've talked about a concrete institution. I'd like what does that look like to you? What does the path forward look like to you? What does this concrete institution look like to you? If you were in control of what the Dissident Right does next, what would you do?
Right. Well, to my mind, philosophy is the king of all sciences. Every science comes out of philosophy. And so, at a certain level, you need a philosophical research institution, a school that is oriented around interdisciplinary work and is somehow organized hierarchically according to metrics that are designed to detect this kind of interdisciplinary acumen. So instead of having subject experts in one domain or another rising to the top and having clout and influencing through the direction of the institution, you need a system for evaluating who has the well-rounded kind of cumulative picture in mind and who can be held responsible then for organizing all of the kind of underlying specialist work in various fields. For years I've been working on this model. I've called it Pure Academy, which is my the model for how a school like that would work. You need to think about how the day-to-day schedule interfaces with setting the hierarchy. And the more I go into this, the more every time I try to explain this to people, it just gets very autistic and hard to relate to. Right. So it's, it is what it is. But so
no, but genuinely, I'm not trying to be like a dick or anything like that. I genuinely want to know how this would function. How would we determine what well-rounded is and who gets to be the final say on what is well-rounded? In your mind, how does that work, briefly?
Yeah. So YouTube has been a big inspiration to me. And what I see is that people engage in their own independent research in whatever they're interested in, and they don't obey strict categories I am a biologist, I only deal with biological topics, I am a sociologist, etc. People range between topics, and that's okay. So accept that as the norm of things. People make these presentations, they present their independent research, and people evaluate that research. Now, that process of evaluation can be egalitarian, which means the best rhetoricians win out, right? If, ceteris paribus, people in general are evaluating presenters in general. It is presentation ability that will rise to the top. And that's what happens on YouTube. That's what happens in the history of mankind. Even the ancients recognized that. So instead, you need a way of filtering that evaluation process based on demonstrated ability. So this basically amounts to a kind of rank-ordered voting metric where you present your work is evaluated by others, and based on the evaluation that you receive, the vote that in turn you input for other content creators is weighted to reflect that merit that you have been established to have. So on YouTube, it would look like, okay, if you have a high subscriber count, you have high like ratios, all of your metrics are good. When you in turn go to evaluate somebody, your voice matters more. You're considered more expert. And so that kind of defeats the raw egalitarianism and creates this meritocratic system in the first place. As far as interfacing between the different disciplines, you do need to preserve a space for each individual discipline, but you need colloquiums to exist or interdisciplinary conferences to exist as a matter of convention, so that you have the math faculty who are expert in their various subjects, who are subject to their peer evaluation using this kind of rank ordered voting system. And those people go to a colloquium with the physics curriculum faculty, who are similarly evaluated according to that meritocratic, vote weighted kind of mechanism. So you would have various colloquiums or like interdisciplinary settings where the same basic process takes place. So you have mathematicians presenting their work, knowing that they are presenting to mathematicians and physicists. They present on that intersection of those fields from both directions, and the same ranking system applies in that domain, and then that gets you then the representative for who goes beyond the kind of math and physics domain into who is representing kind of your branch in the general philosophical colloquium. So I've written out like how that would work approximately, but
can I ask you,
yeah,
are you familiar with Asha logos?
Yeah.
That sounds very, very similar to me to something he has proposed as well. I was wondering if that's
something that he proposed well after I did, and I have reached out to him and he ignored me. So I'm not going to say he stole my idea and then won't talk to me, but it does look that way to me.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Truly.
But the whole point is like we haven't even gotten to step one. Like out of all of these experimental communities, like in the Pacific Northwest, Cascadia, or like there are some towns. There's even a town in Arkansas that's like kind of an explicitly racist town. But like it doesn't amount to anything because no viable research institution has gotten off the ground. Like you said, you got into this sort of because of Ryan Falk. So did I back in 2011. Like I was watching him a long time ago. He is engaged in Sean Last is engaged in the right kind of research. They have their own limitations. They kind of trust in statistical methodologies without a kind of underlying epistemic justification. So
that
like,
would be
what
my
is
main
your
criticism
epistemology?
as well.
Yeah, like how do you know that these statistical methods work philosophically? You need that underlying justification. But in any case, what they're doing is good work. And if you had like a Ryan Falk, a Sean Last, a few other top like Michael Woodley, top level researchers together in an institution, I feel like you'd accomplish way more than all of these scattered, dissident right, decentralized content creators who are mostly individually self-interested, right? Who leverage their own individual fame for their own individual benefit. And usually not even their true benefit. It's just their hedonism that people
right.
leverage. So,
and I guess that was my point in asking you what your solution is, because there are some very real parallels to be drawn between, professors in the current institutions who are setting and driving a lot of the discourse and, political narratives, and content creators on YouTube. What are we doing if we're not giving a sort of lecture? And I just don't want to lose sight of the fact too that part of my solution and there is a time and place for a sort of decentralized effort where you get John Doe out there just sort of shit posting on the internet that does have a net positive if negligible effect that would be cumulative if a bunch of people started doing it. But you also do need some sort of underlying imagine if, like you said, Ryan Falk and Sean Last and even some of the more normie types, because the pipeline from people like Sargon of Akkad to the alt-right was real. That was a real phenomenon. And I think that's part of the reason organizations like YouTube tamped down on dissident right speech and sort of tried to box that up and get it off the platform. Imagine if we got together and decided, hey, these smaller decentralized groups, they can do whatever they want, right? If they right bash, ultimately they don't have a lot of viewership. It's not going to matter if some sort of autistic person spirals out of control and wants to talk about how, really you're wrong about the IQ of a certain group or something else that doesn't really matter on aggregate. But imagine if they all got together and they decided that the barrier for entry is pro-white. This is why we're pro-white, not just some sort of petty tribalism or petty nationalism, but we have been a net positive for the world. Part of this is genetic characteristics like IQ, but also traits that can be traced back to genetics, traits that are heritable, and started really doubling down and pushing hard on those positions instead of squabbling between one another. Like the issue here isn't the voices on the right, it's coordination of the voices on the right to a certain end. So I think we would agree in a lot of respects.
Yeah, it is the problem of coordination, but like underlying coordination is consensus building. And I feel like we are prone to assume consensus because we are dissidents, because we're so radically different from the mainstream narrative, then we think we like are on the same page, but ultimately we're not. Like Ryan Falk is an atheist materialist. I have very little in common with his like fundamental underpinnings of his worldview, even if I agree with a lot of his empirical research that he's
Right.
done. So, yeah, I think unless you have the right discourses established to invite high level um, engagement on deep level philosophical issues, then you will like just invite this kind of like when it's convenient, we will coordinate under like a common idea. But the common idea that you align on, like pro-white or whatever, like it's always going to be kind of too surface level and can't be justified at a deeper level. Like saying that like white people have been a net positive to the world, like that involves a lot of philosophical baggage, right? Saying, okay, what have we done for the world? Well, we've invented labor-saving devices, right? We've saved people from working in mines. We've invented all these things. We have like central heating. We have plumbing. That's reduced incidences of diseases around the world. We increase longevity. Like all these things can be attributed to us. But flip side of all of those things, you can find arguments saying that actually those are not good things. Saying how, well, actually, because we've ameliorated incidence of disease, we've kind of created a dysgenic cycle where people who wouldn't otherwise have survived do survive, and now we're kind of weakening all of these peoples from around the world because, right? Or like with labor saving devices, like we've made life too easy for people, and now like this crisis of mental health is rising. People are subject to like ennui and the mental illnesses that follow upon decadence. So you can always find another side if you just want to present a kind of factual basis for like this is why white people are a net positive. Like it's never good enough because you haven't defined what actually amounts to the positive, what amounts to the good. And someone like Ryan Falk can't actually go that far because he doesn't have an underlying basis for making claims, normative claims about what is actually good for people. He can only appeal at a certain level to commonly held opinions. Now, if you hold to that, it's easy to make a pro-white case. What like commonly held opinions are: labor-saving devices are good, medicines are good, etc. But like that case will only remain rhetorically effective as long as the people you're talking to don't examine these issues at a deeper level. And actually, I think there is a really strong case that like the Western industrial way of life is corrosive and even like potentially an existential threat to our species, like the Kaczynski kind of arguments that can be brought in here. So yeah, so like it's just this I've never seen a way around the people who believe that we should coordinate our efforts have to be able to ante up and show up for like long lasting deep level discourse to get to the bottom of these things. I've had like brief comment exchanges with Ryan Falk and things like that over the years, and in online spaces it's always open to you to like engage when it's opportune and to disengage when it's opportune.
Right.
And so the number one thing dictating what interactions occur is what's advantageous in the media landscape. And that's not good enough, right? That's like, you're not going to get to the bottom of things that way. And so your worldview is never going to get to the bottom of things. Whereas, like, what's happening on the left in the Ivy League universities, where they're creating that centralized worldview, because it is this top-down system where, like, the powers that be dictate what is going to be taught, people do actually, like, put in the effort. And because people, like, stand to gain financially from adopting these ideologies, they all get on board and they get to really deep level consensus. The right can't do that unless, unless I think we have a moral recognition that it would be, like, the right thing to do is to show up for a certain kind of discourse for prolonged periods of time. And that's a big ask. And that's, like, where I've met a lot of resistance. Like, I've talked with, prominent figures in these spheres, Keith Woods, Joel Davis, many times, and see eye to eye with them in a lot of respects. But, like, when it comes down to it, I always say, like, nothing's going to happen unless, like, I'm talking to Keith, you and Joel and, like, I don't know, the Leather Apron Club guy and all these other people who are making content show up in the same space and get down to fundamental issues. And it seems like that's the kind of breaking point where it's very difficult to get past it. So I have very little faith in the future of these discourses. I think we can combat the narrative as much as is possible, and that's okay, that you're doing something. But I just don't see that core of the right wing actually forming unless the physical infrastructure is built and people, and that's what I've dedicated, like, the last 10 years of my life to, right? Like, I've always intended to create a physical school. I have land. I'm building, like, my next purchase will be an excavator so that I can start, really building stuff. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That doesn't guarantee that people are going to show up to my school, but, like, I don't see anyone else doing this. And it seems like unless you do this, I don't see a path to victory. So that's always been my stance.
Well, and as an aside, that's sort of why I'm disappointed to see that the world of internet blood sports has gone to the wayside. Not because, I was there for the spectacle of owning the libs, so to speak, but because it fostered sort of a protracted discourse from which there was no disengagement. Right, you had to directly come to terms with some of these key issues being brought up by your opponent, and yeah, it's it's a difficult thing to, how do we? That's something that was really enlightening to me, actually, just listening to you, is coming to not just a core quantitative measure of this is why white people, and that's one of the things too that I've said about history. The trouble with history is it's such a soft science that, for every one example I put forth to support my, way of thinking, somebody can come up with 3 counter examples just because it encompasses a lot of, things that might not be true, but also all of human history. Anything that's ever happened is fair game. So if there isn't a sort of moral underpinning, I think you're correct that there is going to be, no true path forward. But, where I'm at with it is we're in such dire straits with respect to the demographic crisis here in the United States. And a lot of these ways of thinking are driven at not just a cultural level, but also a genetic level. I personally am willing to work with people who I would disagree with on a moral level, right? I happen to think that homosexuality is immoral. So that's where I would part with a guy like Ryan Falk. But just like,
he said he's not gay now.
So yeah, I heard that, but how do you unsuck a dick, right? Like, I don't know what to say about that. But in any case, he's an ally, and I'm not going to punch right too hard. But I'm worrying, I'm willing to work with guys like that for the continued existence of, founding stock Americans long enough because that's something you're not going to come to terms with overnight, right? That's something that's what philosophy has been trying to get to the bottom of since the beginning of time, is what is morality? What is the good? It's easy to say do good, avoid evil, but what does that even mean? And that's an important thing to talk about. But unfortunately, I met with the reality of tens of thousands of people pouring over our border who have ruined their own countries, hate us, and feel entitled to really loot our country for all it's worth. And so I really don't see a way forward or an escape from that unless we start taking control. Because if you're waiting for somebody to get elected president, right, to fix all of our problems, if you're waiting for, an overarching central power to take the actions we want them to do, or to do the things we want them to do, to take actions, you're going to be waiting forever. Like, the rot has spread too far. The only thing the establishment in Washington cares about right now is remaining the establishment. And so if you suggest more than 5 degrees of rudder shift in any direction, you're labeled as an outsider and you're not going to be able to retain power very long. So we need to agitate on a very local level to start creating breathing room so we can create spaces like the school you're talking about. I guess that's my viewpoint on it. And a key piece of that is slowly driving the narrative back, shifting the Overton window back, and really countering some of these, because the subversion didn't just happen ex nihilo. It didn't just come from nothing. It came from these media platforms. So there has to be a sort of counter to that, because most people, I would hazard a guess that people like you and I are, a little smarter than the average guy. Most people aren't concerned about greater political conversation like this or a philosophical conversation. They're concerned about, they got to pick the kids up from school at 3:00 and also scraping together enough money to create, to make rent. So they're not willing to sit through, an hour and 17-minute long conversation between guys like you and I. They, read a headline. And even if that headline is incorrect, that's what's real in their mind. They watch a really pointed TikTok that seems, to make on the surface a really pithy observation about how terrible white people, especially when the people who are aligned against us aren't even bothering to make any real quantitative arguments for why white people are bad, other than, the sort of atrocity porn that they like to peddle. Like one of my videos is on, some dude on TikTok who's sitting here and saying, hey, they ate Emmett Till. And he didn't outright say whites are all cannibals, but that's the narrative that's being driven, and that's what's going to stick in the minds of the people who see his content. And the comment section is reflective of that. The level of support he got, he had like 100,000 followers, is reflective of that. And so it can't be allowed to stand. It can't be allowed to stand. And it may seem surface level. It may seem like this isn't going to really affect any meaningful, lasting political change. Maybe not, but I don't have a good place to start other than that. I don't know what else to do other than take a step forward in the correct direction.
I said from the beginning, like, I'm very sympathetic with that. And you do have to combat the narratives that are being pushed out. But the thing is, they're well-funded, organized, and they have the algorithms on their side. And we're decentralized, disorganized, and we're inefficient because individual content creators are looking after their own financial incentives instead of, being institutionally minded. Like a reporter working for some institution is not just thinking about getting a paycheck. They're thinking like, I have to make this institution a viable platform going forward. Individuals don't think like that. Individual content creators don't. And so they often like create liabilities too. Like far right content creators trying to do good actually set things back. Like you've commented on how it is it would not be a good thing to attack the power grid infrastructure, however vulnerable it might be. You know, for all these various, I've made a very similar video in the past. I used to engage with this guy, Kurt Doolittle, who I called out basically publicly as a Fed, an obvious Fed. And, you know, he would make these sorts of arguments and make predictions about like the coming civil war. And I would just say, like, listen, if you got the civil war that you're looking for, who during the course of the civil war, who's going to actually be controlling the narrative? All of the communication infrastructure is controlled by the enemy. So, like, it literally doesn't matter what you do on the battlefield. The average American will have the perception that pro-establishment forces are the humanitarian side and the opposition is terrorists, no matter what. And
Right.
the population will not be on your side. So you've made these sorts of points, and I think they're good points. So I you know, I appreciate that you're making them. But yeah, it's like you
Well, and
need to
that was
push back on narratives, but like unless you have like standards where you can vet content that's created, then you run into the same problems that you ran into with the alt-right of old, right? Where anybody with a microphone can represent the alt-right. And then what will happen, and what did happen, the name of the alt-right is besmirched. Like somebody can show up with a Nazi flag, and that's the definition of what's alt-right. However you want to brand yourself, there's no control. It would be like if anybody could publish an article and call it the New York Times. The name the New York Times wouldn't mean anything. So we have a similar problem. And unless you have a centralizing principle and standards, you know, quality control on right-wing discourse, then like wanting to combat the narrative and wanting to push back on these things, I understand where it's coming from, but it can be a liability. So like, that's why I've been very detached.
What's to stop people from, like you and I, from getting together and saying, look, we're going to found an organization and it's going to be called the Shit Libs Suck organization. That's what we are, right? And in order to become a member of this organization, you have to accept core ideological tenets. And, you know, a key part of this organization is amplifying one another's voices, and sort of coordinating attacks against not only certain ideas, but certain ideologues, certain people that are, you know, really detrimental to the political goals we'd like to achieve. I mean, that's something that wouldn't take very much doing other than a handful of guys with, you know, small social media presence comparatively, you know, 10,000 subs here, 50,000 there, getting together and starting to drive real discourse, especially if they're supporting one another. Like, that's a very real concrete action that could happen today. You know, you can get together
Sure.
on, you know, a Skype call and start to hash this out. I know it's not, you know, fantastic. I know that there is something very, very good about getting together in person, something very useful about that sort of dialogue, but it's not outside the realm of possibility, especially when, you know, it's not just ears, it's bodies willing to take action too and sort of drive that narrative to that effect. I just don't think we need something so lofty in order to affect real meaningful change. I think that there are concrete, very real steps that we can take today to make the world, you know, look pretty darn different in 10 years. You know, 10 years is a long time.
Sure. Yeah. And that's why, again, I appreciate the sentiment and wanting to push back. And as far as individual creators of memes, creators of videos, yeah, push back. Like if you have an argument that you've seen on the left, like some, you know, whatever soy jack meme personality puts out some anti-white message or whatever, yeah, ridicule them. Like, sure, go ahead. There's no harm in that. And if things stay at that level, though, I don't see meaningful change ever happening. And so this is why I've been very detached from this kind of decentralized 4chan style type right wing like meme centered or media centered activism. And
And
like
we've talked
I've
very much
yeah.
at this point in time about, media presence, but there is, again, there's a very real positive effect that comes from organizing in person with like-minded people. And that's where it's sort of frustrating to me that people on the right have been so, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, cowardly at this juncture, that they're unwilling to even form some sort of small grassroots political organization, even if it's to affect change in their local community, because they're so worried about the specter of federal infiltration. Like, that's ridiculous. I mean, is life so dear and peace so sweet as to be, purchased at the price of your 9 to 5? Is there nothing you're willing to stand for? And you have to understand too, and stop me if I've already talked about this. I also streamed on a similar topic last night with Adam Smith, but um, I'm losing my train of thought here as well. But you know, it, you're already going to be the bad guy in history, right? If our political opponents win out, you're going to go down in history as, literally every single one of us was literally Adolf Hitler. That's an exaggeration, but we're already looking at demonization of white people in the modern day. Imagine what history textbooks and the common perception will be 150 years from now if we don't succeed here. So if you're worried about vilification, right, that's already a foregone conclusion. But if we come out on top, right, even if you got yourself arrested for protesting without a permit, or, I mean, much like and again, the jury is out for me as to whether or not Patriot Front is sort of a honeypot organization or not. But I think a lot of people point to those people from Patriot Front getting arrested out of the back of a U-Haul and having their faces posted in the media and their names put out there, into the public. And I guess my gut reaction to that is so what? Like, our time here on this earth is so limited that, I mean, yeah, you need to be concerned about your material conditions and how you're going to get your next paycheck and how to put food on the table. But ultimately, there are greater things at stake here, and worrying about, these material goods is sort of what got Western civilization to this point where they've allowed things to degrade and get decadent. We need to stop worrying about the potential ramifications of getting together and forming political parties that take hard stances, even if you're going to be maligned and slandered, because even the Republican Party right now is being maligned and slandered. People forget that Donald Trump was probably the most moderate or left-leaning person on, the Republican ticket up to the 2016 election, and they still maligned him. This was a man who was tolerant of gay marriage. He said he didn't want to do anything about it. And that was not the majority opinion of the Republican Party at the time. But if you, or another key example is like horrible people like Nelson Mandela, who by all counts were responsible for blowing up busloads of children. They're still looked on favorably by history. They're the heroes. If you come out on top, the narrative will be whatever you make it. The victors write the history textbooks, and you need to stop being so concerned about sort of the opinions of people in your social circle, or whether or not the the HR lady at work is going to terminate you for voicing your opinion or whatever. Like, there are important things to do here, and they can't all be done from even discourse in a physical institution, but certainly sort of back and forth on the right, or comment sections on the internet. Like, you need to get out there, and you need to be willing to be maligned and drive real political change by physical action. And hopefully, I think that people on the dissident right have this perception that they're way less popular than they are. People are way less sympathetic to them than they are, because they constantly have really progressive things shoved down their throat. I mean, everywhere you look, even out by me, which is very rural, there are organizations out there flying the gay flag and all that sort of thing. But hopefully, if you can get out there and you can demonstrate, if you can show these people that they're not alone, not just in anonymous internet forums, but concretely in real life, and that ties into forming these political institutions, to forming these these parallel communities. If you can show them not that they're not alone, I mean, that'll have a great impact. Now, you have to be careful of infiltrators, like I was saying in my video. I mean, even if for whatever reason you identify with, and I'm making no comment on to, as to the legitimacy of the cause of Nazi Germany, right? But it's just not useful to be out there waving swastikas. It's just not useful to be out there like Patriot Front is doing, where they're all wearing the same uniform and masks. You need to humanize yourself. You need to be the average Joe. You need to show them that you're not crazy. That's going to be much more attractive.
Yeah, but again, controlling those aesthetics is only possible with a centralized institution setting standards. And anything short of that is anarchy, and any Fed organization can crop up to give you a bad name, to create the straw man that they can then burn as effigy against you. So it just seems like the right wing will always fall prey to this problem of factionalism and decentralization and like a lack of organization until a codified, hierarchical, ideologically coherent core is built. And I have zero faith in that being built outside of physical institution. Physical institutions can be built now. That's what I've wanted to do for a long time. But it's just difficult because that involves actually changing your lifestyle. I think people use online activism as a kind of parasocial outlet where they're neglecting their actual social lives, and they feel like they're satisfying some instinct because they talk to people on Telegram, or because whatever it is they feel that they're doing, and generally it amounts to nothing. And yeah, people on the far right have come up with some powerful arguments, but people on the far left have come up with very powerful arguments. And because they, on the far left, have those codified institutions, have those places where people can go and become trained, their top performers are doing a lot better. Like Vaush argues better than Nicholas Fuentes, even if people don't want to hear that. Like, yeah, I've agreed for years, Nicholas Fuentes is the most talented person on the right and who could have a political future. He's not as talented as Vaush. And I don't like Vaush. I'm not being biased in that. It's because Vaush, as a Fed, went to whatever Ivy League or, affiliated institution he went to. He got the training because they have those institutions established. We don't have those institutions established. But I know we've been talking for a long time now, and maybe we got to go soon here. But
right.
The deeper point that I go to is all of these political issues, like salient political points that we think about: homosexuality, transsexuality, transhumanism, our stance on those things, nationalism, ethnic stocks, immigration. All of those are very high on the totem pole as far as like fundamental values and fundamental metaphysics and like what's there in our worldview. Those are like high level emergent structures, not the most deep-seated structures. And if we don't attack the most deep-seated aspects of the worldview, like materialism, like empiricism, like the way that ultimately the Enlightenment philosophy with its metaphysical presuppositions led to these higher level progressive conclusions, if we don't get down and challenge those things, then the same problems will just reoccur, as we've seen in the right wing. Like the right wing pits itself against these progressive tendencies and then ultimately is just lagging 10 years behind. Why is that? Because like it's kind of dialectically necessitated by the structure of their thought, which is structured by Enlightenment thinking. So unless you get down to those fundamental philosophical issues all this surface level stuff is just going to repeat itself. And like it's actually better to create an institution that is philosophically oriented than one that is politically oriented. Because if you try to create like the white nationalist think tank society, yeah, you're going to get Wagoed. But you don't have to do that. You can create like a more pure philosophical research institution that doesn't have white nationalist commitments, but believes that, okay, if we like settle this foundational stuff appropriately and reconcile with the classical Greek metaphysics, like if we make sense of the world at a fundamental level, then all the high level stuff will just follow as a result. I believe in that. And I have like, we could go through specific arguments why, like, how could I derive the importance of racial identity? I can in my worldview. I would bring in some arguments like, Sheldrake's morphic resonance and some ideas from quantum mechanics and some random stuff, seemingly random stuff, but it's derived from first principles. And I don't make those arguments as much. I don't focus on those like high level things as much because that's the kind of stuff that gets you banned. That's the kind of stuff that gets you in trouble. Whereas the deeper level stuff, making the case underneath where your opposition is making their case, is what allows you to, I think, fundamentally transform people's worldview. And so anyway, that's just to justify, and I'll let you have the last word after this, but that's why I've taken my approach of like, I'm not going to worry too much about persuading the masses because it doesn't matter what the masses believe, to be honest. It doesn't. And like to mount a meaningful opposition, you need people to recruit from, but the kind of people you need to recruit from should be able to be persuaded on first philosophical principles, and white identity should be able to be treated as a downstream obvious implication of deeper level like principles of freedom, autonomy, etc. Or I don't know how you want to frame it, like principles of sovereignty, principles of
right,
many different ways to argue for that conclusion. But that's been my approach. So
no, and that's very interesting. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation so far, and I'm truly appreciative of you sort of giving me this platform on your channel. If you've watched to this point, I mean, I would assume that you've enjoyed the sort of dialogue we've had here. So if you want to check me out, I'm sure Eric will do me the courtesy of putting my links in the description, or you can just Google Combating the Narrative or throw it in YouTube. I'm on BitChute, Rumble, Odyssey as well. So, but with that, I think we'll just end it here.